Good evening. Damien O'Donoghue and Dun, agus is mission an Laurel County. Good evening, everybody. My name is Damien O'Donoghue, and as County Librarian of Tipperary County Council Library Service, I'd like to welcome you all tonight to this event. Nenagh Library is an EU Direct Information Centre and Edic for counties Tipperary, Limerick, Cork and Kerry. And as part of our programme for events for 2021, we are delighted to host this talk entitled Protecting Our Citizens and Our Values, the European Union and Security. I would like to say a bit about this topic at first. In this, the final month of our stewardship of the Edic in Nenagh, we wanted to address the very relevant topic of security and cooperation between member states within the EU. The title, Promoting Our European Way of Life, Protecting Our Citizens and Our Values, comes from a list of 6 broad priorities of the European Commission. And within this, we looked at the specific topics in the policy area of the European Security Union. Specifically the issue of working with member states and EU agencies to build an effective response to countering terrorism and radicalisation, organised crime and cyber threats. In the face of the increasingly sophisticated challenges to our security, which we've all seen, this talk should be of interest to everybody, not just those involved in the areas of law enforcement or security, not just politicians or lawmakers, or even just members of think tanks and media organisations or students or political science. The list goes on. But to anyone who has an interest in the international issues in today's challenging world, what happens on the international scene impacts us at home, and where so many of the areas that the European Union is fighting to take the lead globally. As with all of our Edic events, we would hope that to leave the audience in better informed on the subject. And to that end, we are very fortunate to be able to welcome Professor Andrew Cottey from the Department of Government and Politics in UCC. Andrew is a professor and an EU Jean Monnet Chair in European Political Integration at the Department of Government and Politics at UCC. And he was head of the Department of Government and Politics from 2013 to 2018. He's teaching and researcher in the areas of international relations and international security. And he's actually been a member of a NATO Research Fellow, a Research Associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the IISS, and a visiting lecturer at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. His publications include Security in the 21st Century Europe, and he co-authored Understanding Chinese Politics and Introduction to the Government in the People's Republic of China. That's quite a CV, and we're really very fortunate Andrew has agreed to speak to us tonight. It's something we believe in as an edict, that we always get the very best knowledge and ability and the very finest speakers, and we have again tonight. So without further delay, I'd like to hand you now over to Professor Cottey. Thank you.
In this talk, I'll examine the EU's security role. I'm going to use some PowerPoint slides, so I'll bring those up in a second, but you'll be able to see me in the small screen as well. One of the ways the EU describes what it does, both internationally and internally, is protecting its citizens and protecting the EU's values. So we can think about that in terms of security issues. One way of thinking about this is just thinking about the context, the environment in which the EU finds itself today. And for a decade or more, some analysts have been suggesting that the EU faces what they describe as a neighbourhood in flames. So a neighbourhood of the EU regions neighbouring the European Union, characterised by conflict, instability, and a range of other security problems. So, for example, we could think about the situation in Ukraine, and only in the last few weeks there's been a build-up of Russian military forces on Ukraine's eastern border. But we could also think about other conflicts in places like Syria, Mali, Libya, and we could also think about other problems like the migration crisis over the last decade or so. So the large point here really is that Europe faces a challenging regional and global environment. What I'll do in this talk then is look a little bit at those security challenges. So what are the kinds of security problems and challenges that Europe and the European Union face in the early 21st century? And then I'll look at 3 specific areas where the EU has developed policies over the last 20 or 30 years and is active. So I'll look at the EU's role in foreign policy, the EU's role in defence, and also the EU's role in what's referred to as internal security. And I'll explain what that means later on. We can begin, therefore, by thinking about the range of different security challenges that Europe, European states, and the European Union face. Some of these now are perhaps once again of a kind of classical state power character. So we already mentioned Russia in the context of the ongoing conflict with Ukraine since 2014. We can also think about the rise of Chinese power and perhaps the increasingly authoritarian character of the Chinese regime. And some observers are describing what they refer to as new Cold Wars between the West and Russia and between the West and China. We can also think, as I've mentioned, about internal conflicts and civil wars in a number of countries bordering or close to the European Union. So as I've mentioned, Syria, Ukraine, Libya, Yemen, Mali, and one could think of others as well. Other threats include, for example, weapons proliferation and terrorism. So we can think about the situations in North Korea and Iran. North Korea probably has a small number of nuclear weapons at this stage. Iran is suspected of developing nuclear weapons. And at the moment, European diplomats are actively trying to resurrect the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement, which put limits on Iran's nuclear program. We can also think perhaps in terms of less traditional threats. So European states have experienced terrorism in recent decades with major attacks, for example, on London, Madrid, and Paris, and smaller terrorist attacks on other European cities. And beyond that, then, the security agenda gets even wider and more complex. So we can think about cybersecurity, digital threats. And recently, for example, something called the SolarWinds cyber attack on the United States has been in the news. The US argues that this has been a major cyber attack sponsored or undertaken by the Russian government, and recently the US has imposed new economic sanctions on Russia as a response to that. We can also then think about other non-military problems as well. And obviously over the last year or two, we can think about the COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused very large deaths, and indeed the number of deaths caused by the COVID-19 pandemic have recently gone over the 3 million level globally. And we've seen massive disruption to European societies and economies as a consequence of something like COVID-19. We can also think about things like migration, climate change, organized crime, all of which in some ways threaten the security, the lives, the livelihoods of European citizens. So there's a very complex and wide security agenda out there. And over the last 20 or 30 years, the European Union has been trying to respond to that agenda. A little bit maybe more broadly about the European Union. If you think about the European Union and the whole European integration process since 1945, one way of thinking about that is about the balance between integration and state sovereignty. Integration implies giving power to the European level, to European institutions in order to try and achieve particular objectives. Sovereignty implies trying to maintain or defend the sovereignty of nation states. And throughout the history of the European Union, there has been this balance between integration and the sovereignty of the member states. So the European Union is an interesting combination. It's a kind of hybrid, if you like. So the European Union combines intergovernmental cooperation, so cooperation amongst the member states with the decisions and power being in the hands of the member states, the sovereignty element, if you like, but then also elements of devolving power to supranational institutions like the European Commission and the European Parliament. Some people define this in terms of what they call pooling sovereignty, and this is particularly relevant to the security issues that I'm examining in this talk. So the argument here is that the best way to address a range of problems is by pooling sovereignty via the European Union. So, for example, if you think about many of the problems that I just listed, climate change, migration, organized crime, many of those problems cut across state borders. So as a consequence, then addressing those problems really requires international cooperation. They can only be addressed effectively if there is international cooperation via institutions like the European Union. There's also a logic which I described there as united we stand, divided we fall. And this is really an argument that Europe is much more effective if it acts collectively. In global terms, even big European states, Germany, France, Britain, are arguably small states in a global sense when you compare them with, let's say, China or the United States. So the logic of this is that if European states want to be able to address a range of global issues from, let's say, climate change to maybe the Iran nuclear issue, they need to act collectively, and they can only really be effective if they act collectively. So if you think about all of this, the whole evolution of the European project has been defined by continuous debates over the appropriate balance between integration on the one hand and state sovereignty on the other hand. And that debate continues. And here, perhaps we can just think about Brexit for a moment. Brexit, if you like, as I've put it on the slide there, is maybe the ultimate assertion of state sovereignty, the ultimate way of asserting state sovereignty via the European Union is to assert the right to leave the European Union. And of course, one of perhaps the few positives that we might think about in terms of Brexit is that the European Union is a democratic institution, and ultimately, if any state chooses to do so, then it can freely choose to leave the European Union, and the European Union won't seek to stop it. So, as mentioned, what I'll do is look at really three elements where the European Union plays a security role: foreign policy, defence policy, and internal security. And then I'll make a few conclusions. If you think of foreign policy, since the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, the EU has formally had what it calls a common foreign and security policy. And the Maastricht Treaty was central because the Maastricht Treaty was the point at which the European Community became the European Union, at which the euro single currency was established. And the other big development under the Maastricht Treaty was this common foreign and security policy. One of the key things that then has happened is that new institutions have been put in place to try and develop and implement this common foreign and security policy. A number of things maybe to note about this EU foreign policy. The first thing is that the decision-making remains largely in the hands of the member states. So, for example, there's a Foreign Affairs Council which brings together the foreign ministers of the EU member states. That meets on average every month and sometimes more often. And the member states take the decisions collectively via this Foreign Affairs Council. And below this Foreign Affairs Council, there are a whole range of other committees where the member states develop and take the decisions. The other thing we can note about all of this is that this operates alongside national foreign policy. So it doesn't replace national foreign policy. So there's still an Irish foreign policy, a German foreign policy, a French foreign policy, and so on. We can also note the role of EU institutions. So in the context of this, the EU has developed a post of a foreign policy high representative who represents the European Union. That post is currently held by the former Spanish Foreign Minister, Josep Borrell. There's also a European External Action Service, which is the kind of EU foreign ministry in Brussels. And then the European Commission and the European Parliament also have roles in all of this. What has all of this meant in practice? How has the EU actually given substance to all of this? So we can look briefly at a number of areas, and I'll then illustrate that with a few examples. One big area has been neighbourhood policy. So I mentioned this idea of the European neighbourhood being, if you like, in flames. Well, the EU has been trying to address that through what it calls its neighbourhood policy. So through dialogue with neighbouring states, through providing economic aid to neighbouring states, and through holding out the prospect of membership enlargement, for instance, to countries in the Balkans, or a couple of decades back to Central and East European countries that are now members of the European Union. A second suite of areas where the EU has been active has been on global issues. So the EU is active in the UN, trying to support the activities of the UN. The EU is active on climate change. The EU is a leading provider of development aid to poorer countries globally. And finally, then, I've mentioned there what the EU refers to as strategic partnerships. So the EU has also been developing relationships with other big powers, with countries like the US, China, Japan, Russia, and others. So the EU has dialogues with these countries, tries to develop cooperation with them, and so on. I'll now maybe just turn to a couple of brief examples that can help us to understand and think about all of this. One area is climate change, and you can see this image there from the Paris Climate Summit back in 2015. This was when the big agreement, the Paris Agreement on Global Action on Climate Change. And as this slide indicates, the EU is united and committed to full implementation of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. But if one looks into the detail of all of this, one could argue that perhaps there wouldn't even be a Paris Climate Change Agreement without something like the European Union. And since then, the European Union has been trying to advance global action on climate change. So that's just one example of where the EU is active in this kind of area. We can also take another example, the Iran nuclear agreement, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. The Iranian nuclear issue has been on the agenda for 2 or 3 decades now. Iran was widely suspected of trying to develop nuclear weapons. And you can see here an image of Federica Mogherini, a previous EU foreign policy high representative, with the Iranian foreign minister in 2015. And these were the talks which led to an agreement, the basis of which was that Iran would accept international constraints on its nuclear activities. And in return for that, the EU and the US and other countries would lift economic sanctions which had been imposed on Iran. So this Iran nuclear agreement was another good example of the EU trying to drive diplomacy to address an issue like nuclear proliferation. The Trump administration withdrew from this agreement. The Biden administration is now beginning to re-engage with it. And the EU is again active in trying to help to maintain and resurrect this important agreement, helping to limit nuclear proliferation. On the other hand, though, we need to be realistic about EU foreign policy. So I've taken this cartoon, which is from the Economist magazine, and this was referring in particular to the EU's policy, or perhaps failed policy, vis-a-vis the Libya conflict. So the cartoon captures the image of EU member states pointing in a range of different directions. So you can see there, I've described this as a sometimes divided European Union. The European Union can be effective where the member states are able to agree on and pursue a common position, as in the example of the Iranian nuclear issue. Where the member states are divided, it gets much more complicated. And as this cartoon illustrates, if you look at something like the Libya situation, you see EU member states pursuing rather different policies and the EU struggling to develop a common policy. I'll now turn to the EU, the issue of EU and defence policy. So up until the late 1990s, the EU didn't have any kind of common defence policy or any military role. This, of course, has been controversial sometimes in Ireland and has certainly been a matter of public debate. And I'll come on in a few minutes to say a little bit about, if you like, the Irish perspective on all of this. But in 1999, the EU agreed to set up a common security and defence policy. At the time, this was sometimes described as the establishment of a European rapid reaction force. And some people thought that this meant really a European army, but that language and that image is probably misleading. So the EU hasn't put in place a supranational European army. Rather, what the EU has been engaged in has been defence cooperation amongst the member states. So in particular, the EU has given itself the capacity to undertake military operations and also, under this heading, civilian crisis management operations. And indeed, as we'll see in a moment, since the early 2000s, the EU has undertaken more than 30 of these operations. Also, the EU put in place new institutions to help to manage, develop and implement this policy. So you can see on the slide I've mentioned something called the Political and Security Committee, also an EU military committee, a small EU military staff, and the EU European Defence Agency. Again, going back to one of the things I said about foreign policy, control of this and decision-making remains very largely in the hands of the member states. So, for example, this Political and Security Committee, it's also known as COPS by its French acronym, brings together the 27 member states of the European Union to take collective decisions on the development and implementation of this common security and defence policy. The other thing to note is that contributions to this, in terms of, let's say, contributing to EU military operations, are undertaken on a voluntary sovereign basis, with member states deciding whether or not they want to contribute in any particular case. The overall objective here on the part of the European Union has been to enhance, to strengthen collective European military capabilities, so to strengthen the military capabilities of the member states, but also the military potential of the European Union as a collective entity at the EU level. But if you look at this, this has been a slow and difficult process. So this has been going on for 20 years, and this process will likely continue to evolve in coming years. Maybe to give some substance to this, we can look a little bit at the kinds of operations that the EU has actually undertaken in this context. So this, as you can see, is the official list of EU CSDP, Common Security and Defence Policy, missions and operations as of late 2020. And you'll find this on the website of the EU European External Action Service, along with lots of other information if you're interested in further detail. But you can see here, if you look at that map, the EU has been active, for example, in the Balkans, in Kosovo, in the Palestinian territories, trying to support the development of the Palestinian Authority. It's been active in Africa to a significant degree, and also in parts of the former Soviet Union, for example, Ukraine and Georgia. The kinds of things the EU does often is to try and support peace processes. So, for example, if you look at the Georgian case in the Caucasus, since 2008, since the war between Russia and Georgia in 2008, there's been an EU monitoring mission on the ground, monitoring the borders between Georgia and the Russian-backed separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Or if you take other examples, for example, in places like Niger, Central African Republic, Mali, the EU has been trying to support these processes, trying to help to train armed forces, security forces and police, and so on. So that gives you some sense of the scale of activity. And you can see there, as of last year, the EU had about 5,000 people employed in these various missions around the world, but particularly focused in Africa, the Balkans, Middle East, and the former Soviet Union. Briefly, also a bit about what's sometimes referred to as internal security. So internal security gets at issues which at least traditionally were involved as issues internal to the state. So things like terrorism and organized crime. But what we've seen over the last few decades is increasingly these kinds of, at least what were formerly viewed as internal security challenges, have become transnational or internationalized. They cut across state borders. So if you think about terrorism, think about organized crime, think about cyber security, think about issues like migration, all of these are issues that cut across state borders and really straddle the border between internal security and external security. So since the 1980s, indeed, so if you think about that, for 4 decades now, the EU has been trying to develop cooperation amongst its member states and put in place institutions to address these challenges, which pose real threats to the security of states and to the livelihoods and security of European citizens. And you can see there that in 2020, the European Union put in place what it called a European Union Security Union strategy for the period 2020 to 2025. And you can see there that prioritized 3 elements: fighting organized crime and human trafficking, countering terrorism and radicalization, and fighting cyber crime. And again, maybe to go back to a point I made earlier, if you look at this, again, one sees this mix of cooperation amongst member states, but also elements of activity at the EU level institutions and EU initiatives. So again, this element, if you like, of pooling sovereignty or trying to balance integration with state sovereignty. And again, we can just take one example maybe to illustrate the types of things that the EU does in this kind of space. So you can see only this month, the EU put in place a new strategy for the period 2021 to 2025 on combating trafficking in human beings. And you can see there that strategy identifies 3 priorities: to identify and stop human trafficking at an early stage, to go after the criminals who are engaged in human trafficking, and to try and protect the victims of human trafficking and help them to rebuild their lives. And if we think about human trafficking for a minute, you can think about, for example, children, women and men who are trafficked, in some cases, for example, into prostitution, in some cases into near slavery and so on. So you can see the kind of human suffering that something like human trafficking involves, and that's why the European Union is trying to address this issue. Briefly, a few words perhaps on the Irish perspective on all of this. As a neutral state, Ireland is obviously distinctive. The majority of EU member states are also NATO members, but of course other neutral states, Austria, Finland and Sweden, are also neutral states. Neutrality is perhaps a rather ambiguous concept. In international legal terms, neutrality means non-belligerence in war, so not joining in to any given war, and therefore it also means not committing to membership of military alliances. But beyond that, neutrality may mean a variety of other things, and therefore the boundaries, if you like, of neutrality as a concept and a practice are perhaps somewhat fuzzy, and different people take neutrality to mean different things. If one looks at all of this, and particularly Irish engagement with EU foreign security and defence policy over the last 20 or 30 years, successive Irish governments have argued that the kinds of things which the EU does and which Ireland is committed to through the EU are compatible with Irish neutrality. So they argue that the EU is not a military alliance, and in the context in particular of the decisions on defence taken in the Nice and Lisbon Treaty, specific guarantees were sought by the Irish government and obtained which protect the Irish commitment to neutrality. The other thing which the Irish government points out is that decisions on the deployment of the Irish Defence Forces, whether the Irish Defence Forces are deployed on an EU mission or, for that matter, a United Nations mission, remain in the hands of the Irish government and also of the Dáil. My view would be, therefore, that I think the Irish government's argument is broadly correct, that what has been established in the EU in terms of foreign security and defence policy cooperation is compatible with Irish neutrality. The other point that we can think about, though, is the advantages that the island gains from cooperation on foreign security and defence policy with the European Union. Ireland, of course, is a small state, and inevitably, therefore, Irish power and Irish influence is limited. So working through the EU allows Ireland to enhance its influence and to better address security challenges. So, a few conclusions. As I said, the European Union can be thought about in terms of this ongoing balance between integration and sovereignty. And the argument for the European Union, particularly perhaps in relation to foreign and security policy and security issues, is really this argument about pooling sovereignty, that by pooling, by sharing their sovereignty, European states are stronger when they're united and are better able to influence issues, including things like the examples I've given, climate change, or maybe the Iran nuclear question. And the other point, as I've emphasized here, is that security challenges are increasingly transnational in character. They cut across state borders, and therefore you need collective responses via institutions like the European Union, because they can't simply be addressed at the national level. And if you take a big picture look at this, if you look at the European Union since the 1990s, the EU has come a long way in developing collective foreign defence and internal security policies. But at the same time, the EU faces a very challenging international environment. Think about the European neighbourhood in flames, think about global challenges like climate change, think about the rise of China and how to address China's increasing power. And as I illustrated with that cartoon and the example of Libya, there are still divisions amongst member states. So in a way, I would end by saying, watch this space. There are a lot of ongoing developments, and we have to see how all of this will develop. And take just one thing that's in the news at the moment in April of 2021, which I mentioned earlier, the Ukraine situation. Right now, Russia has been building up its military forces on Ukraine's eastern border. We don't know exactly what Russia's intending. We'll have to see how that plays out, but it also raises questions about how European states and the European Union will respond. So I hope this talk has given you some insights into the kinds of things the European Union does in the security sphere. If you're interested in more on this, there's lots on the websites of the European External Action Service and of various bits of the European Commission. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Andrew. I would just like to say a few thank yous. I'd first of all like to thank Andrew. It's been a privilege to listen to him speaking this evening. It really is great to see an expert in their field, and it's something that we enjoy very much in this edict, that we bring in the very best to speak about these topics. And you can see it, and you can tell by the interaction with people how impressed they are with him. And we've had a lot of feedback, so we can tell that it was a great success. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you for giving your time and to us. I'd like to thank the staff of Nenagh Library, Nenagh Edic, who yet again have delivered an outstanding event. These events run very smoothly, but what you find is they don't run smoothly without somebody in the background doing a lot of hard work. And the team in Nenagh Edic have always worked very, very hard and have done it again. So thank you to them. And finally, I'd like to thank you, the viewers who tune in and listen to these events. Without you, you are the lifeblood of what we do. Without your support, we will not have success. So just say thank you to you as well. And say good night and stay safe.